let's see. Let's take a seat there. Is this one on? Apparently it is. Okay. Thank you very much. The idea of this doesn't sound on to me, is it? Yeah. Okay. So the idea of this is to have a nice Q&A with Sebastián, of course, and welcome to Pygrunn. We met, of course, in this morning. It's great to have you here. And as I said this morning, what is interesting when we started up with Pygrunn, one of the first, I would say, keynote, there were only like 20 or 30 people there, but one of the guys that came in, we had an expert coming in, was Armin Ronacher, the guy that invented Flask. So now we're like, well, 15 years along the way, and then Flask is like being caught up by this new kid on the block. So now we have his successor. Armin now went off to do something else. I think he's in Sentry nowadays. So it's great to have you on the team. FastAPI is picking up like crazy, I would say. If you look at the stars and the popularity and the way it's being applied, it's really one of I think one of the most popular Python libraries available nowadays. So it's nice to have like a Q&A with somebody like you. We're going to see the keynote, of course, this afternoon, which will undoubtedly be very interesting. But it's also good to ask questions about the project, about you, how you came to FastAPI, what the background is, how you look at it, and also have some audience participation time. So if you have any questions, then please raise your hand, and I'll make it a little bit of an informal discussion. So first of all, welcome aboard. And also feel free to ask questions back, of course. I mean, it shouldn't be a one-way question. So, yeah, so of course, we'll start with a very difficult question. What's up with your mustache?
Well, thank you very much for having me. And thank you for being here. Like, I don't really know why you're here because I don't have much interesting stuff to say. But like, yeah, the mustache was just like, I don't know. This is a serious question, right?
Yes, yeah. yes.
So the mustache was just like, I was just like playing around, actually copying my grandfather. That like, I don't know, my grandfather was like 70 something and decided to start learning to paint. And then he decided to grow a mustache. And I was like, oh, that looks fun. I'm going to copy that. And like now I just cannot take it out because it's like, you know, yeah. But yeah, it's just that. There's not much more story to that.
No, but you're very recognizable, of course, by a mustache. It's a funny thing. It's also and the name itself, Tiangolo, that's like, it sounds like a magician. But
the name also doesn't have like a great story behind. It's just like, you know, my name is Sebastián. The end of Sebastián is Tian. And my family will just like say Tian, and they just kept adding random stuff. So my parents and my sisters were like Tian, Tiango, Tiangolo, Tianguis, you know, like a bunch of random things. And then like Tiangolo was available in like Gmail and Yahoo and like all those stuff. Yeah, well, let's just keep that. And then now it's just like Tiangolo on GitHub and Twitter, and like I cannot change it. So yeah.
Okay, well, funny story to you. And how did you get into programming, by the way? If you look at the amount of work that you put out, I mean, it's like quite amazing how much you do, and how much code you crunch out, how much commits you do, etc. So you want to, this guy must have been programming since he was 0 years old. Can you tell a bit about how you got into programming, what your interest was, and what your background is a little bit?
Oh, that's kind of a funny story. So I'm homeschooled. I didn't go to university. I actually didn't go to school. I went to elementary first only, and then afterwards I was like homeschooled all my life. So I was studying with my parents at my house. It didn't even have a name. It wasn't homeschooling. It was just like the weird kid that doesn't go to school. That was like what I was. Then I was also helping my parents with their like small business. They had nothing to do with tech. They still don't. They still keep asking me, what is it that FastAPI thing about? What does it do? Like I keep explaining. They still don't know. But anyway, at some point I was trying to help them. Like I was trying to help them with their business and like just like. First, I was doing like graphic design, and then like also like some music production and video edition and stuff like that. Just like trying to get into computers because I liked computers. They were much more like people persons, but I was always into machines and computers and stuff. So I was trying to help them in the areas that I could work in, and I was doing like graphic design and that stuff. And like I realized, oh, they probably need a website. And it's probably something easy and simple to do. Like it's just like copy paste and like moving things like graphic design. Of course, it was not. But like I wanted to try to learn that and try to do something for them. It was like when I started doing that, I was like, I don't know, I think 15 or something like that. And it was, you know, just like copy pasting things from forums and stuff and trying to learn HTML and CSS and like just some JavaScript and some alert like hello world. And I was like, oh my gosh, I made this. This is so amazing. Yeah. But, you know, like it was that was sort of the beginning, but then I didn't keep like programming a lot for a long time. I was just trying to install like things, and I was trying to help them solve problems. And I was just like installing things like a content management system or like a CRM or something to help them manage their company, their very small company, and a bunch of tools. And like, like I was trying to make that such like an enterprise company. Of course, they never used any of those tools. But I ended up learning a bunch of things along the way. And then I ended up taking a bunch of courses, online courses, Coursera, edX, Udacity, like a bunch of courses from a bunch of universities around the world, online, when I was like, I don't know, 20 or something. And then I got really into Python and into coding and algorithms and all that stuff.
Was there one course that got you interested in Python? Was there a specific course that you remember that was very good?
It's fun because like when I started taking those courses, I only knew JavaScript, and I had the idea that I had to learn everything about this single thing that I know. So I know a bit about JavaScript, and I have to learn everything about JavaScript before I start trying any other language. So I ended up going very deeply into JavaScript and like taking these courses and doing like, like quizzes and stuff for cryptography and algorithms in JavaScript. And there was not even like Node.js. It was just like plain JavaScript on the browser. It was crazy, and it was weird and fun. But then one of these courses required Python. And they just like had a cheat sheet of like, you can learn Python, like just the small things that you are gonna need to use in this like small things. So I ended up just like learning the basics of Python in like, I don't know, a couple of days or like a week or something. It's like, how didn't I see Python before? Like, I have been missing this all my life. And like that's how I ended up getting into Python, like for real, just to be able to take that particular course. That was about artificial intelligence from Berkeley or something like that.
What's quite interesting, you started up and thinking, okay, before I start using JavaScript, I have to dive really into the details and understand all the details before I can dive in and build something useful, apparently. But then you switch to Python, and then you learn Python, and you see all these web frameworks, and you weren't afraid by taking on all the existing big frameworks and by just going ahead and starting your own FastAPI framework, right? So you weren't scared at that moment.
I was actually very scared. No, I was actually very scared, and I was avoiding building something new for years. And I was actually, and which I think is like for me, it's been a very practical and functional approach to not try to build something new, but try to learn how to use the things that are already there to solve the problem and to, like I always say that it's important to focus on solving a problem, not on innovating or disrupting the market or something, just like on solving a specific problem that is important to you. And that's what I was trying to do. I was just trying to solve problems about, the thing is that I ended up working in this startup. We were building products that were always related to data, machine learning, distributed systems and stuff like that. And we got the chance, because it was sort of a consultancy, we ended up building one product after the other, and it was sort of similar in many cases for different clients, but it was always starting from scratch. So I got the chance of starting again and again and again and iterating on that process of trying to refine how we were doing things. And I was like leading a team of developers and like seeing them make the same mistakes and like get confused with some things and like, okay, I need a way to make all this better and to have like better data validation and have better documentation and like to avoid to have like all these problems of like missing to synchronize or to change some data that should be changed in one place, but also in another place, a bunch of those things. And I was just like trying all the frameworks and all the tools that I found. And while I was doing that, I ended up learning a bunch from all these frameworks as well. So I ended up getting like a bunch of the ideas and the features of, oh, I really like how this works. I want to have this. And then I also did that with like, I ended up working with a bunch of front-end frameworks as well, and I wanted to bring some of those ideas to the back-end side as well.
Can you name an example? What kind
for example, in the front end, it's very common to do dependency injection. It's something that is not very common in the backend side in Python, but it's something that can be very useful in very specific use cases. And I wanted to have that in Python, but I also wanted to have it in a way that was like simple to do and to use without having to do like all the complex details that I was seeing in the front-end side. But I wanted to have like those same types of ideas and to bring them. Also, because I was working a lot with TypeScript in the front-end side, I realized that these type annotations that you can have in Python or in TypeScript are actually what powers the editor to give you auto-completion and inline errors. That's the thing that allows the editor to give you that. I didn't know that before, and I wanted to have that, and I wanted to have that in Python. By that time, they released Python 3.6, which is the one that like allowed like all these new features dealing with type annotations. And I realized, okay, now I can have auto-completion and inline errors for like all the code that I write if I just write it properly. But the frameworks were made the previous frameworks were made before those features were available, so they didn't have a way to exploit those features and to take advantage of that. So at some point, I was just like trying to get all those things together, and like the best I could have was just like a fragile combination of a bunch of plugins. With at that point was Flask. I was also trying a bunch of different frameworks, but like the best thing I could have was that. But I wanted to have it in a way that was simplified and that will take advantage of these features like type annotations and also async and await and like get all these extra performance boosts that I could have. So it was actually trying to bring all these ideas together and like putting them together in a single place, also making it based on standards and like all that stuff.
And what would you say was then the biggest problem you were trying to solve? Was it performance? Was it ease of development? What was it?
It was I think it was a list of checkboxes that I wanted to tick.
Which one was on top?
Several, but I wanted to have auto-completion and inline errors in the editor. So I wanted to have a good developer experience. For example, to give you an example, I don't know if you have seen like in many cases when you are using the interface for a package and you have a method or a function or something that receives some parameters. And then you try to hit auto-completion and it shows you ** quarks. And it's like, go to documentation to see what are the things that you can pass to that. I wanted to not have to do that. I wanted to get auto-completion for each one of the parameters. So I defined the internals of FastAPI in a way that I will have auto-completion for all those things. That meant having a lot of duplication in the internals of FastAPI, a lot of extra burden in the maintenance side, on my side as a maintainer. But I wanted to have like that great developer experience when working with it. So I wanted to satisfy myself as the developer, not as the maintainer of FastAPI. And like that was one of the things that I wanted to have, auto-completion everywhere. I also wanted to have like good performance. But like the good performance actually comes from the tools that go underneath. FastAPI doesn't really do anything super sophisticated to have good performance. It's just because of the tools that go underneath. I also wanted it to be based on standards, on OpenAPI, JSON schema, OAuth 2. And I didn't want to have that as an afterthought, like that is added afterwards with some plugins or something. I wanted it to be part of the framework so that people wouldn't have to learn something else or like tweak things around. Like if people wrote standard Python code, the simplest way they could think of writing that code, they will have something that was based on standards and that will have data validation and like everything, like all the best practices by default without having to add additional effort on top. I think those were kind of like the main things that I wanted. Also like, like code simplicity and reducing the amount of data information duplication. Because in some cases, it's not just like code duplication. If you see the same pieces of code in multiple places, okay, that's code duplication. But if you are defining in some way, hey, this is a string, but you are defining that for data validation, but in another place you are defining, this is a string, but this is for documentation, and maybe you have to import a different class to define that this is a string, it's actually different code, but it conveys the same information and is duplicating that information, that this is just a string. I wanted to avoid having to do that and to be able to have code that was as simple as possible and as consistent as possible across the whole application. Yeah. Also to make it very easy for the developers that I was working with to share the code, to have like auto-completion inline errors, and to detect mistakes very easily and to avoid allowing making those mistakes.
Yeah, very well done. Which editor, by the way?
Sorry?
Which editor?
Which editor? So when I was creating FastAPI, I actually wanted to make sure that it will have like a great developer experience for all the editors, because like people use different editors, which is kind of a fun thing that I didn't write the internals of FastAPI. I wrote I wrote first the design of how it will look like, how it will work like. And then I made sure that it will work great in VS Code, PyCharm, or the editors that were based on Jedi. So those are the main engines that do the thing behind the scenes. Like, you know, when you are working with a Vim or something like that, it's normally powered by Jedi. And when you're working with, well, PyCharm is just like their own internal system. And VS Code used another language server. Now they're using Pyrite, which is actually internals of Pylands. Like, you don't really need to know any of that. But the thing is, like, I tried all the editors to make sure that it will work in all the places. And the thing is, FastAPI is all based on the standards of Python. It doesn't do any magic trick. It's all made to use the standard ways to define type annotations in the way that the type annotations actually mean something. So it's not like bending the rules of those things, which means that in most of the cases you get a good developer experience and auto-completion, inline-errors, all that stuff in any editor, because they are just like supporting standard Python. Yeah. So for editors to have good support for FastAPI, they just have to give good support to standard Python. So that was kind of the idea. And like, yeah, well, that has been like the idea.
It has been the idea. Okay.
Yeah.
We got a question for the audience. Jean-Paul.
Audience participation.
Yeah, audience participation. So come on with questions if you have one.
So yeah, very interesting to hear about how you thought about the design of FastAPI when you got started as a developer and how you wanted it to look for you, right? But now things have changed because everybody is using it, right? And so that also must mean that you get a lot of feature requests and things. People are comparing it to frameworks like Django and other frameworks. So how do you think about it now if you have to decide what feature requests you're going to implement or going to merge in, or like what's now top of your mind? Did it change from when you got started, or like can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, like the funny thing is, like, it hasn't really changed that much. There's a bunch of feature requests and a bunch of ideas from other people. Some of those ideas I actually have like implemented. For example, there's this guy, Adrian. He created this other framework that was like inspired by FastAPI called Expresso, and like was like the main idea was to play around with types, and like he got an idea that I recently implemented in FastAPI. Like, he was recently saying like, this is the best outcome, is to inspire something in FastAPI. That's the best outcome of like having played with that. So there are some features and some ideas that I actually have received from other people. There are also many features and many things that is just like things that I've had in the backlog. And there's also like this thing that I ended up having to learn so much of the internals of how these type annotations work and how these things work underneath. There are many things that not many people need to understand, or like end up like, you know, just like going down the details to try to see what is this for. And there are many cases, many things that people don't know. These things could be built this way or another. So in many cases, I end up just like adding something to the framework, something that not necessarily everyone will have asked for, but that will simplify a lot of the things. An example of that is a recent upgrade to how you define parameters or like dependencies using annotated, which is this new feature of the typings from Python that makes helps your code to be consistent, to be able to use the same code outside of FastAPI and making sure that everything works correctly. So there are also like a bunch of these ideas that is just like things that, I don't know, that I have ended up learning, or like other people ended up learning. For example, the people from Pydantic, that is just like, hey, there's this new thing that not many people know about, but it will improve things a lot, and we can just like implement it and like provide it to a bunch of others. So in many cases, it's also like that. I also get a lot of feature requests and also like a bunch of PRs, and like it's always a struggle to decide what to put the effort on, because I try to put the effort on whatever will have the biggest impact. But at the same time, that sometimes means, you know, like delaying some of the other things that people are asking, or like answering questions. There are so many questions. That's the biggest time bottleneck. But yeah.
Another question from the audience? Yeah, over here. Yeah, great to meet you, by the way. What I'm curious about is you're talking about a lot of things about strongly typed languages, dependency injections, which are available in other languages. Of course, we're all fan of Pythons here. Python, that's why we're here. But my question is, you decided to invest a lot of your time in developing these tools for the Python community, while you could also have switched to another language, another platform. What's the reason you invested this much time in the Python community?
So I actually first tried to betray us and leave to another language. So I actually first tried
Glad you
to...
stayed.
Sorry?
Glad you stayed.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm glad that's fine. Because you're like, at some point people will say like, why are you doing this weird stuff with types? That's not the way to go, but now they accept it. So I first tried to work with TypeScript, and TypeScript is great. The syntax for adding types is very powerful. Sometimes it's like too powerful. You can do everything with that. I also tried with Golang. I think Rust wasn't like that big around. But the thing is, in Python, as a programming language, we have this particular feature, this particular benefit that almost no programming language has, is that we have access to these type annotations at runtime. At runtime means that whenever you are executing the code, you can call a function that says, hey, what is the type annotation for this specific variable? And then you can get the type annotation for that variable from the same Python code, which is the thing that FastAPI does underneath. So you define type annotations, but they are not just in the other programming languages, or at least in most of the cases, all the cases I know, these type annotations will be used to compile the code or to make sure that the code is correct, but nothing else. In FastAPI and Pydantic, and like because we have this feature in Python, in the Python internals, these type annotations are used not just to check that the code is correct, but also to do data validation, data serialization, documentation, data filtering, a bunch of things that are just only possible in Python. They are just not possible in other programming languages. So even though the typing language and the typing system and the typing capabilities of Python are not as good as in other programming languages, we have this particular feature that allows doing all these things. And the typing ecosystem and like the language is growing organically to the needs of all these things. So I think it's a very exciting moment for like how these things are evolving. But like, yeah, I think that will be the main reason why this makes sense in Python, is just because it's possible. It's not really possible in other programming languages. And at the same time, I really wanted to stay in Python because I have been always like, wanting to do artificial intelligence and machine learning and stuff. It's just that I got stuck in doing APIs. But like, like if we want to do these types of things, these types of very cool things that we can do in Python, and that we can pretty much only do in Python, then like we just have to stay in Python. So being able to stay in Python and do all the other data parts and like API parts was just like the best solution. But the best solution for solving the use cases is just that it implied a lot of work of building a framework that would use those things, but like having it, it was like the best combination for me at least.
Thank you. There's more questions there, but one thing I wonder is, what was the toughest thing to implement while doing FastAPI? What was the thing that really gave you headaches and going like, oh my God, how should I solve this? What was the thing that really... So I might be stuck here, I might not get out. Was there one moment at all in this whole project you went like, oh, I have no idea how to do this, and how did you get out of this situation then?
One moment, that was a continuous of that feeling. Like, when I started, yeah, like I was convinced. First, I was convinced that I was wrong, and that there was something completely flawed about my ideas, and then there was something that I was going to realize, oh, I was completely wrong. This didn't make sense from the beginning because of something. And like then I was convinced that I was doing something wrong in the code and it was going to explode in my face at some point. It's just that things kept working, so I just kept working on that, and like they have been working. But like I didn't really expect it to really work. One of the things that was like very challenging before writing any code, any FastAPI code, before even knowing the name or anything, I was actually spending a long time studying the standards, OpenAPI, JSON schema, or through like all these standards that go underneath that actually power how things are designed and work in FastAPI. So that was a lot of work that is quite boring. But like it can be done. Then afterwards, I contributed a couple of things to the underlying libraries, to Starlet, which does all the web parts, and to Pydantic, that does all the data parts. So Pydantic, I implemented the first version of the JSON schema support, like based on the standards for Pydantic. I think that was probably like the most challenging part, getting into the internals of Pydantic, because Pydantic does all these fancy tricks to get the information of the types and do the data validation, serialization, and all that stuff. And to do that, it had to, like get into the internals of Python, not at the C level, but still like the internals of how these objects work underneath. And And there were a couple of cases where some of the APIs or some of the things were not even documented. So the only way to know, like, what is this attribute that I'm using here, that Pydantic is using here, and that I have to extract, like, where is this defined? It's not in a standard, it's not in the documentation, and it was just like in the source code of Python itself. So it was like, that was very challenging, and that was probably the point where I thought, like, I shouldn't have started this, but like now we are like too deep down working on this, so let's just like try. I think that was probably one of the most challenging points, just like working on the internals of Pydantic.
Yeah, really nice to meet you, by the way. I have one question. So you mentioned there are a lot of feature requests for FastAPI. Do you see there will be any standardizing community in the future to decide what to do and what not to do?
It's a funny thing that I mean, like there are a bunch of feature requests. In many cases, it's not really feature requests, but requests to solve whatever is that person's problem. So in some cases, like, hey, why don't you have like an ORM integrated with FastAPI? Why isn't it like an ORM like in Django? And the thing is, it doesn't make sense to have something that is tightly coupled with FastAPI that you always have to use a SQL database or something like that. Because in some cases, you don't need a database at all. Maybe you don't need users. Maybe you're talking with bots. Maybe you're using a NoSQL database. So it's something that doesn't really make sense to build something that is tightly coupled. But for example, for the case of using SQL databases, then I ended up building another library for interacting with SQL databases that will have like very good integration with FastAPI, but it's actually not dependent of FastAPI, and FastAPI doesn't depend on that thing. So it's sort of solving the problem of that particular person, but not necessarily solving it the way that they imagine it will be solved. There are also many requests for things like that. There are some, for example, there are also some pull requests trying to implement something, but the most common thing is that some person will come and try to implement a pull request that will solve their use case and their particular problem, but independent of if it gets merged or not, they will not come back easily to contribute more things or to try to see if there is something else to fix or anything. It's normally like a one-shot thing. And there's a bunch of people that help me a lot, in particular, answering questions. That's the thing that actually takes the most time. And that's what consumes most of the effort and time, is just answering questions from other people. And that's the thing where I get most of the help. For pull requests and for those things, like in some cases, some people come and help and review them. And when it's like one of these like bunch of people that help a lot and that are like deeply involved in things, like it's great. But I still review each one of the pull requests myself, and in many cases they require a bit of fine tuning afterwards, like like fixing things that are maybe broken or like adding tests or documentation or things like that. So for now, I still check each one of the pull requests and each one of the things to make sure that everything is consistent.
Wonderful. Thank you. I teach a lot. I teach a lot about FastAPI as well. I love your work. I have to say you combine a lot of great features into something that's new and wonderful. Basically, I have two questions for you, if that's okay. First of all, about SQLModel. In SQLAlchemy, there's now also native data class support. So do you feel that SQLModel is now maybe less necessary? Do you feel that maybe at some point you don't need it anymore because SQLAlchemy will be friendly enough? So that's question one. And question two is, what's your next big thing? What's the next big feature you're going to implement?
Cool. So first on SQLModel, like I wish I could just say like, oh no, SQLModel is deprecated now. Just like go and use SQLAlchemy, because that was like sort of the original intention. It was like maybe SQLAlchemy will have all these features and all these things. And actually, SQLAlchemy 2 got a lot of inspiration and tricks and ideas from SQLModel. They actually say that publicly, hey, we are like adding these tricks and these things from SQLModel. So working directly with SQLAlchemy is a lot better now. Than for some of these particular features, you actually don't need SQLModel. But still, SQLModel has this thing that SQLAlchemy cannot do. That is that each model is both a SQLAlchemy model and a Pydantic model, which means that you can integrate it with FastAPI directly without duplicating. So for those of you that don't know, SQLModel is a library for interacting with SQL databases. And the thing is that you declare how many of you have used an ORM, like Django ORM or SQLAlchemy? Okay, cool. A lot of you, not all of you. For those of you that haven't, it's a way to represent a database table in a class, and each one of the rows will be each instance of that particular class. So it's a way to map between the database and code inside of Python. That's what an ORM does. And then SQLModel is a tool that allows you to do that, but then the same classes that you define are also at the same time Pydantic models. So you can define the data that you receive on the API, the data that you store on the database, the data that you return, or the data that you use to update some record on the database. You define all that with the same types of models. And because each of these SQL model is both Pydantic and SQL Alchemy at the same time. You can share a bunch of the features and a bunch of the attributes. So you can use inheritance. You don't have to duplicate the information in a bunch of places. What you will end up doing if you were using another library is that you will define like the 12 fields of some table in whatever is the library that you're using to interact with the database, but then defining the same 12 fields in Pydantic to do all the data validation and serialization and documentation for the FastAPI application. But when you do that with SQLModel, you just define it in one single place, and it applies to both. And you can like filter things and add things and stuff like that. Now, the thing is, SQL Alchemy is the thing that powers everything underneath, and is the thing that does all the work to communicate with the SQL database. So my library on top is SQLModel. The library underneath is SQL Alchemy, which is from someone else. That is like, the biggest library for interacting with SQL. And then the thing is, SQL Alchemy, the thing underneath, took a lot of those tricks from SQLModel. But it cannot do the thing of being both a Pydantic model and a SQL Alchemy model. And a SQL model. So you cannot use that directly with FastAPI to do like all the data validation and serialization and all that stuff. There's also things that I have to improve. For example, that's one of the big things that I will do soon is upgrading SQLModel to have support for SQL Alchemy 2. And I also want to add migrations internally in SQLModel using the same Alembic, which is the same tool that you will use for SQL Alchemy. But then like having a bit of, different documentation, simpler documentation, and a CLI that will simplify like working with these things and like just like simplifying things a bit, but the work will still be done underneath by SQL Alchemy and Alembic. And now the big thing that I'm working right now, which is like the biggest thing that will come out, is FastAPI with support for Pydantic version 2. So Pydantic version 2 has been rewritten, or is like in the process of being rewritten in Rust. So you don't have to learn or use Rust, but it's running Rust underneath. So you get like between, it's like 10 to 30x performance without changing any of the code in Python. And then FastAPI is going to be compatible with Pydantic version 2, while also being compatible with Pydantic version 1. So like people can upgrade FastAPI and then decide when to upgrade Pydantic and like do the transition more easily. It's a shit ton of work, but like that's the thing that is going on. That is like one of the biggest things right now. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Are we running out of time, or?
I think we are. Yes, we are 4 minutes over.
Oh, well, I'd like to thank you very much, Tiangolo.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time.